Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being with us, whether in person, on the live stream, or viewing this later on. My name is Steve Schaefer, and I'm the director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. We are pleased to welcome you today to the Regulatory Transparency Project's conference, America's Energy Future, Abundance or Scarcity. Note, all expressions of opinion today are those of the speakers. I want to give special thanks to experts Jeff Holmstead, James Coleman, and Mario Loyola for helping to plan this conference, and especially to Sarah Bengtson and Marie Blanchard. I would like to introduce Jeff Holmstead, who's a partner at Bracewell and chair of the Regulatory Transparency Project's Energy and Environment Working Group. Jeff is a partner at Bracewell and heads the firm's Environmental Strategy Group. He formerly served as Assistant Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency Air and Radiation, and holds the distinction of being the longest-serving leader in this role. Jeff is an exceptional professional and also a great person. So, Jeff, please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. I hasten to add that I was assistant administrator under the George W. Bush administration, just to give myself a little credibility here that might not always attach to someone from EPA's Air Office. It is my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Andrew Wheeler. I suspect that all of you know him personally. Some of you, but you certainly are aware of his career in Washington. But I'm going to take just a minute to introduce him anyway. He is, after serving for maybe 8 years in public service, he recently joined the law firm of Holland and Hart, where he is a partner and the head of the Federal Affairs Office. As you probably know, during the Trump administration, he served briefly as the deputy administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and then served, I think, for almost 3 years as the administrator of EPA. But that did not diminish his interest in public service. After leaving EPA, he served in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There he established the Office of Regulatory Management, and which was an office that was designed to reduce the burden of regulation on businesses and consumers in the Commonwealth. He also served there as the acting secretary of Natural History and Resources. Some of you probably remember Andrew from his time on Capitol Hill, where he served from 1995 to 2009, culminating in a 7-year stint as the chief counsel at the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. Andrew is someone who has thought deeply and cares deeply about environmental and energy policy, and I know that career staff at EPA was impressed that he sometimes knew more about their issues than they did. I will also say that he gained the respect of the senior career staff at EPA because of his genuine interest in understanding their views on policy and legal issues, even though he sometimes didn't agree with them. Two quick things before I turn the time over to Andrew. You should know that he did his own personal investigation into the effects of climate change by hiking all over Greenland this past summer. And second, you never wanted to get into a competitive game of Trivial Pursuit with Andrew, because he, and I don't know if his understanding of trivia probably is something that helps him greatly given everything that's going on in Washington. But Andrew, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I want to thank the Regulatory Transparency Project and the Federalist Society for inviting me here today. Back in the 80s and early 90s, my former boss, Senator Jim Inhofe, did a series of presentations with former Energy Secretary Don Hodel. They had looked back at all of the armed conflicts over the past 100 years and found that the side with the greater access to energy won almost every single conflict. To paraphrase one of my favorite books, and now a movie, he that controls the energy controls the universe. Shout out to Paul Atreides. So where are we here today? First, we have a war in Europe, with many European countries still dependent upon Russian natural gas, and the only thing that saved energy prices and demand was a warm February. We have a war in the Middle East that is still on the verge of expanding into a broader regional conflict. Here at home, our strategic oil reserves are at the lowest levels since 1984, since the Biden administration sold off the reserves in 2022 to bring down the price of gasoline. And so far, they've only refilled them 4%. President Biden has placed a pause on the approval of LNG exports until a public interest determination is made. DOE announced at a hearing 2 weeks ago that a decision will not be made until March of next year at the earliest. And this administration has approved the fewest federal acres for land lease sales since World War II. I think the disconnect between world events and U.S. energy policy has never been more stark. And speaking of the Starks, winter is coming. I promise that was my last movie reference. If you want to read my 50-character movie reviews, you can follow me on Letterboxd app. What is our current regulatory approach? Let's take a look. In March, the Biden administration finalized their CAFE standards, which calls for 2/3 of all autos sold by 2032 to be EVs or hybrids. It's actually 54% EVs and 14% hybrids. Last week, the administration finalized their new utility regulations. 4 regs, which will basically shut down existing coal units by 2039, and requirements for CCS for new natural gas. The Energy Information Agency at DOE estimated that the proposed rule, they haven't yet modeled the final rule, but the proposed rule would have resulted in 155 gigawatts of coal unit retirements, and they estimate that only 20 gigawatts of natural gas units are planned to be built during the same time frame. That is a huge delta. Now, the NRDC said, don't worry, there are plenty of wind, solar, and battery projects planned. But there is not enough planned to make up the difference. And there are delays in those projects as well. For example, the only Atlantic offshore wind farm currently on track is the Dominion project off the coast of Virginia. The other projects are running into cost and supply chain problems. All of the renewable energy projects are running into permitting delays and transmission siting concerns. We need wind and solar, and I support both. But we really need baseload generation, and that is still fossil fuels and nuclear for the foreseeable future. Now, I mentioned the delta on what is going to be retiring and what the NRDC claims will be built. But that only gets us to our current demands. It does not take into account enhanced manufacturing, which everybody wants on a bipartisan basis. It doesn't take into account the U.S. data center expansions, which we need for our internet economy. It doesn't take into account artificial intelligence. It doesn't take into account chip manufacturing that we so desperately need to onshore here in the United States. And it doesn't take into account 2/3 of our cars being powered by electricity by 2032. We can't afford to only focus on the replacements for what we have today. We have to focus on more energy. Our energy demands are growing, but our energy plan isn't. In the last 15 years, we have gone from energy dependent to energy independent to energy dominant to now energy policy abdication. I hope that Jim Inhofe and Don Hodel were wrong. But I do want to end on a positive note. Our oil and natural gas industry is finding more innovative ways to extract, also in a more environmentally sound manner. We have governors like Governor Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, who's pushing for a nuclear moonshot with SMRs. Our battery storage industry is greatly improving their capacity. We just need to also open up our critical and essential minerals reserves here in the U.S. to meet the demand. And our wind and solar technologies have greatly expanded over the last 20 years. We can, once again, become energy dominant, but we need federal policies that recognize the need. Thank you very much, and I look forward to coming back up on stage during the lunch period. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. We wanted to set the stage by having a presentation on demand growth, which Administrator Wheeler already mentioned. When I asked around town about who the right person would be, the name of Louis Finkel kept coming up. Many of you probably know him. He is the Senior Vice President of Government Relations at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, thankfully better known as NRECA, where he directs the association's federal, state, and local government relations activity. Prior to joining NRECA, he also held senior positions at API in the Grocery Manufacturers Association and in the Government Relations Office of ExxonMobil. In addition, he had many years of experience on Capitol Hill. Louis?
Good morning, everyone. Jeff, thank you. It is always humbling to have to follow the former EPA administrator. Administrator Wheeler, I'm going to try to do service to what you just walked through a little bit. The topic I'm going to talk to you about is demand growth. It is impossible to have that conversation without a backdrop, at least a starting point of where we are on generation, and a conversation about reliability. Okay, so there is no question in our minds, and what I share with you today is on behalf of 900 electric cooperatives that serve 42 million people across the country. The communities we serve consist of 92% of the persistent poverty counties in America. We are the hardest to reach areas, the most expensive to reach areas, and the most at-risk communities in an economy which the lights may not stay on, and if they do, the price is going to be extraordinarily high, okay? So as we think about these issues, we think about demand growth through the context of both electrification and digitization, and now kind of reindustrialization with the billions and billions of dollars that have been spent over the last couple of years to onshore manufacturing again, both for things like microchips that fuel our digital economy, but also for green tech, which has been over-invested in and tried to bring back onshore to make us more competitive in the global marketplace. We think about a supply chain that's totally broken. We think about both announced, and I'm going to talk about both, announced and now prospective retirements because of the EPA rule. The administrator talked about permitting challenges. I don't think there's any question that whether you want to build a gas plant, whether you want to bring more solar online, you can't build the transmission. You can't site things in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to try to talk about this in three contexts, okay? Residential growth, commercial growth, and industrial, and each one has some pretty interesting and terrifying dynamics to them, which we've watched evolve over the last 2 to 3 years. All right, so let's lay the predicate, okay? Not my numbers. These are EIA numbers and publicly available numbers on retirements, okay? So by 2030, our economy is expected to add 80 gigawatts of demand. And in that same window, announced retirements of always available power, okay, gas, coal, and nuclear, is 80 gigawatts. Now, I'm not that smart, and I wasn't that good in math, but I know that that is a big gap. So when you talk through the three sectors it's important to quantify and think about what those challenges look like. So I'm going to start with residential, okay? So the administrator mentioned EVs and federal policy driving it, right? So we're supposed to have a 20-fold increase in electric vehicles by 2030. Okay, 20-fold. So that means level 2 chargers in homes. That means fast charging infrastructure. So to replace a traditional gas fueling station, gasoline, diesel, so 8 pumps, okay, so if you were to pull out those 8 pumps and drop in 8 fast charges in its place. Now, obviously, it's not going to happen exactly that way, but if that happens, and that happens in communities around the country, we're talking about 10 megawatt substations, okay? So electrification with vehicles. But it doesn't end with electrification for residential consumption. So it used to be that you had summer as the peak for demand across the southern tier of the country, and that's now radically changed. Okay, so we're going to use Texas as our example, okay? State of Texas, in 1990, home heating was 40% electric. 2018, 61%. 2022, 67%, okay? And that's before you start talking about heat pumps. This is just electric baseboard heating for homes. Okay? State of Florida is a winter peaking system. Just digest that for a second, okay? Higher population in the middle of the winter, all electric heating in the state, high population growth. So you have states like South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas, migration from north to south for retirement, an economy that is attracting in more and more industrial development, whether it's microchips or auto manufacturing. This is resulting in population growth. This is resulting in electric growth. And this is just on the residential side. So that's before you start talking about Department of Energy efficiency standards that are going to push more and more electric for water heating instead of gas, that incentivize more and more heat pumps. Okay, so residential electrification is without question a huge piece of this demand growth. So I'm going to layer back in the generation side. No matter how much wind and solar you build, you still talk about a capacity factor that's radically different. And it's not always available. The level of intermittency, even with long-duration batteries, will continue to be a challenge, especially when peak demand in the state of Florida in the middle of the winter is from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m., and the capacity factor of the solar is well below the 28% ratio. So let's move to commercial. CBRE, one of the largest commercial owners and leasing entities in the country, projects that 80% of new commercial leases between now and 2030 will be data centers. Just digest that for a second. 80% commercial leases will be data centers, right? And the consumption profile of a data center is not that of an office building. This is always available, always on, uninterruptible power. So, and when you overlay that with where the residential shifts are and the locations of internet hub lines, which is a huge driver for where you put these data centers, you have this horrible mismatch of where generation exists, where generation is needed, and it further compounds this domestic shift. So, again, these aren't my numbers. Talking about an additional 35 gigawatts just by 2030 for new data centers, and that's current projection. 35 gigawatts just for data centers. And frankly, I think the numbers are low, This is based on previous assumptions on what data consumption is before we actually know what AI does and doesn't consume. So the average AI data center doesn't use a little bit more power. It's almost double a traditional data center because the computing rate is so much higher, the number of servers that are processing at a higher rate, the technology in microchips is driving consumption in this space faster and quicker. So let's talk about manufacturing. All right, so Goldman Sachs projects that announced industrial construction in the United States, projects already announced to be advanced, is $170 billion. And you've already moved forward with stifling consumption of other energy resources to power these facilities. And most of them were going to use a lot of electricity anyway. So you've ensured electrification at these facilities as the primary energy consumed source. So where does it come from? 176 billion projects out at some place around an additional 60 to 80 gigawatts of power consumption. So when you take together this, both residential migration, residential electrification, the advent of AI, plus traditional cloud computing, where we have a digital economy which keeps driving more and more, you have onshoring of manufacturing, there's no place to go anymore. So you end up looking for cheap land, you're looking for a transmission line, you want to build another transmission line which you can't build. Okay, so all of this assumes a rate of economic growth, and that's before you talk about inflation and supply chain breakdown. You've got this confluence of three factors which don't go away. You have generation that's going away. You need more time, you need more technology, and you surely need more transmission to make this all work. Thank you.
Take a 10-minute break here, so if you want to grab coffee in the back or use the restroom, please do, and then we'll commence at 10:45. Thank you.